Well, good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is that you're watching or listening with us. Welcome to the Living Streams Deep Dive Podcast. My name is Alec Seekins. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm joined today by David Stockton, our lead pastor, and Dan Riccio, one of our elders, and my favorite person to talk for hours to. Today we're going to dive in a little bit to the message from this last Sunday. David Stockton brought us through, I think, our third of the messages, right, on present church. We did a little past church, a little present church. Next week, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary, and then we're doing a little future church. But this past week, David was talking about engaging in society's pain as we kind of rounded out three of the phrases that would be baked into, I guess, like our vision or mission or where we're trying to go. And so what are those three phases? And then maybe you could unpack your message, unpacking engage in society's pain.
Yeah. The three parts of the mission statement are display God's glory, which we did a few weeks ago. And then we have my brother, my world traveling brother on the podcast, talk about that. And then we talked about building courageous people, and that we did the podcast on last week. And then last Sunday, was engaging in society's pain. And so we spent the message talking Matthew 25. We went into there where Jesus is telling parables, and it's a parable of the final day where he's talking about returning and separating sheep and goats. And then he says that the ones that are the sheep, the ones that get to experience the inheritance, are the ones that cared for the hungry, the poor, those in prison, those who are sick, and essentially Jesus was saying that when you did it for the least of those people, you did it for me. And so we talked about how it's important it is to engage, and we don't have to save everybody. We don't have to fix every situation, but we just have to feed, clothe, and that takes a little bit of the pressure off, so I emphasized that. And then we went to Philippians chapter 4 and talked about Paul said, it was so good of you to be concerned, but it was even better when your concern showed up and showed up in the gift from Epaphroditus and really ministered to him. And he said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, which is great. But then he said, but it was good of you to share in my troubles. And so we talked about sharing in the troubles in our society. And then, got a little word from Greg Boyle and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, some quotes from those guys.
Those are some good guys to get a word from.
Yeah. And then finished just talking about the last 7 years, how Living Streams has organizationally engaged in different points of pain, social challenges here in Phoenix. And
what was that? Do you remember what was that little key phrase in the Greg Boyle quote? I remember thinking, ooh.
Yeah.
Do you remember
the quote?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's what we seek is a compassion that doesn't stand in judgment at how the poor carry their burden, but instead stands in awe at the size of the burden that they carry.
Yeah. Yeah, that was such a challenging and unique angle and perspective.
Yeah.
Convicting a little bit.
Well, and he worked with Homeboys in LA, Homeboy Industries, and wrote Tattoos on the Heart. That's where that quote comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of pain out there in the world for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that was that I think was such a challenging thing. I think especially right here in this moment as like we've had this major increase of homelessness, but it's hard how homelessness in this country is so almost inextricably enmeshed with substance abuse. Not every homeless person has major substance abuse issues in this country, but as we've seen the economy deal with pressures and strain, and as we've seen a loosening of restrictions around substances, and as we've seen an influx of new substances, it's a different thing. For me, it hits different seeing homeless encampments and homeless people here in the States these days than it did 5 or 6 years ago in the States, and then it does in other parts of the world where it's like, oh, here we, like in other parts of the world, you often you go and you see people who are there for a lack of opportunity. And it's really hard not to wear the jaded American lens and see people who are there for the opportunities that they chose to pick. And I also have spent enough time with enough homeless people to know that that's not the full story. It just is so easy to see that, you know what I mean, when you see the substances. And I think the story you shared in that quote was really convicting to just remember the weight of what people are carrying, regardless of like how entangled it is between, oh, here are burdens that I put on myself and here are burdens that the world put on me.
Yeah. Well, and I told the story of Jacob, who was a friend of mine, who had a 20-year wrestling match with heroin that actually cost him his life. And just, the weight of what he was carrying each day. I mean, I'd spend a few hours with him and I would go home just like almost so fatigued from just having my shoulder under his burden for a little bit as we ate some Little Caesars or something like that. And yet he was carrying that every single day and couldn't just go away and feel free of that burden. It was always there gripping him. And that was a heavy thing. But there was a little gift at the end of that night. Dan and I were actually emailing before the message, and so he said it was a big deal for him too.
I thought it was really cool. I got a perspective that not many people got, because David and I had exchanged some emails, and he had told me that story via email as part of his sermon notes and everything. And then we were at the same wedding that night. Mm-hmm. So the next day, when he's doing the sermon and saying, this is the thing that happened, this guy at the wedding goes, oh my gosh, I know that Jacob. And, he was the one who invited me to Young Life and everything else. And I was hearing, David had put the qualifier out there. I already had this plan beforehand, but I got to see he already had it planned beforehand. And I was going, no way, that is so awesome.
It hit different.
Even in sharing that story, my feedback that we had exchanged in an email was really like that, because it was, I can't own this thing for someone else, and I'm not called to take ownership of it. I had used the example of an Old Testament scholar that was doing, a lecture from Deuteronomy on creation care, and an activist that, a young person getting up and being like, great, this is awesome. So how are we going to take control of environmentalism and change the world? And the lady that was the professor just went, we're not. All we're called to do is offer another kingdom. I'm called to be faithful and offer another kingdom. And that was the picture that I saw in that story, was I'm going to continue to offer another kingdom. Not in a way that just goes, I'm going to disengage, but here's practical steps. I can go and be present and have pizza and share and pray and go home exhausted and all of those things. But the Lord showing up and working through that brokenness, to me, is just a powerful statement of, we're called to faithfulness. We can't own everything. That's not meaning not engaging, but it is, what's the Lord given you to do? Because if we take it on as, all right, it's my job to fix the world, well, that's overwhelming. But it's my job to point to the one that fixes the world, and to show up into places where, everyone's, written off the idea that the world's fixable, and like, no, there's one who cares, and he will bring new creation.
I just, I'm coming to the end of the book. What is it? Something like Jesus with Middle Eastern eyes, or something like that. Here, I'll tell you guys, I got it right here. But anyway, it's somewhere between a book and a collection of commentaries on a lot of Jesus' stories of Jesus and Jesus' parables. Jesus through Middle Eastern eyes. Cultural Studies in the Gospels by Kenneth E. Bailey. And he was talking about the parable of the talents, particularly in Luke. It emphasizes some different things than it does in Matthew. But he pointed out that the servants were rewarded not for being successful, but specifically the master rewards them for being faithful. And he was even looking at it a lens of saying, hey, you have this big wealthy guy who leaves the country, gives his servants some funds and says, hey, go invest this in business, is what it says more or less in the Gospel of Luke. And he's saying, you have this unstable power structure in the Middle East today, and certainly back then as well. And so when this guy's leaving, it's like, who's going to fill that void? Who's, like your guy's gone, like not everybody likes your guy. And so to take that money and to open up a shop in the name of your master who's gone is kind of a risky thing because, well, the guys who don't like him might not be so into that. You know what I mean? And so the servant who then buries it is being careful. He's kind of saying, he's playing the political move, saying, well, this way I'll still have my master's money if he comes back. But if he doesn't come back, if he loses, if he, you know, if his enemies kind of take over here, like, I'm okay. You know what I mean? I didn't tie my name up with him too much. And so what he's saying is like, hey, well done. You were faithful to me. You were on my team. You know, you trusted that I would come back, that I would be good, that I would win, you know, whatever. And so they're rewarded for their faithfulness, not for their skills in business, which I think as an American, we tend to read it as, oh, they're rewarded for their successful business ventures, you know. But he's very clearly, you know, it says you're rewarded for your faithfulness. And then the author then quoted Mother Teresa, who at one point in time was asked, like, how do you keep doing this knowing that there are still so many poor in Calcutta, like, and lepers? Like, you're never going to be a drop in the bucket. And she responded by saying, well, I'm not called to be successful. I'm called to be faithful. Just a very long-winded way to rephrase what you just said, I think.
Yeah.
But,
well, I think it's big, though, because especially now in our cultural moment where we have, you know, everyone's telling us about all the problems in America and then how they're the solution to fix those things as far as politicians and things, but just inundated through all the media about not just the problems in our local community, which that's what most people used to have to deal with, but we have to digest the problems in our community from so many different angles and you know, exaggerated. We also have to digest the problems in all of our country, digest all the problems in all of the world, everywhere. We're digesting all of this all the time, and it really can get overwhelming. And that's the beauty of the way of Jesus, right? I was talking with some pastors this morning at a breakfast that it's like, I love that Jesus didn't give us answers. He gave us a way. And the way of Jesus is actually pretty simple. You love your neighbor. Like, that's what I'm asking you to do. You give a cup of water to a thirsty person. You give some food to a hungry person. I'm not saying you get rid of all hunger in the world. I mean, obviously, if you have the capacity, that's great. But what he's asking us to do is just do what we have grace to do. And that's been a big deal for me, is like, no more, no less. Lord, help me not do more than you're asking me to do, which again is an American thing. It's like, oh, Dan, you want me to do that? Well, I'll do 7 of those things and then you'll be really happy with me. Mm-hmm. But it's like, no, I just wanted you to do the one thing I asked you to do. And I think, you know, Christians, if we all just did something, that would be a lot of thing. Like that would be a really, really big dent in the depravity in our world. And so that's what we're trying to do.
It's kind of like the picture in Nehemiah where everyone's supposed to build this section of wall in front of their house. Mm-hmm.
As a family even.
Yeah, let's do this as a family. Because if you're going to build lots of sections of walls and overwork yourself and wear yourself out, and then other people are going to see, oh, look at how good they're doing, I'm going to go into that same activity, then we have an overworked society that prizes that. And it's kind of like, oh, yeah, that sounds familiar.
How do you guys wrestle with, and if possible, guard your heart against, I think the two opposing sides to what we're talking about, that faithfulness, the jadedness of, like, you know, like I think I was saying, like, oh, like they got what they deserve. They asked for, like, this is a result of the decisions they've made, you know, and B, the hopelessness of the overwhelming nature of the quantity of society's pain. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What is that wrestling resistance?
I think to not be overwhelmed, like, or grow weary in well-doing, as the Bible says. That's a bit of what it is. It's just keep coming back to, okay, what is Jesus asking me to do? What is he giving me strength? What is before me that I can do? That's been a real helpful thing, because the times where I feel like I need to do more than the Lord's given me grace for is the time I get burned out so fast. And And that, as far as getting jaded, I don't know. That's a good question. I think spending time with people who are in pain and trouble, I think it quickly breaks down any jadedness you might have. But if you're not proximate to the pain, but you just kind of are viewing it from afar off, I think it's a little easier to be jaded. But if you're actually, engaging with it, sitting down with someone. I remember one night we took all the deacons from the church out and we just went up to Sunday Slope area, and it's probably like we probably went about 7:30, and we got a bunch of Whoppers from Burger King. And I just told the guys, I was like, just go, hand out burgers to the people. But the goal of the burger is to be able to get to know their name and hear their story and pray for them. And so I remember just sitting next to a guy who, I gave him the burger, and I just sat down next to him. He was sitting on the ground, and he was, just like, kind of not writhing in pain, but just like could not sit still. His body was just like, there's just tremoring the entire time. And basically what was happening was he was paranoid, from being out exposed in the streets for that long, but also just he just was needing a fix, and he was not sure how he was going to get the next one, and he was doing all this stuff, and he was, he calmed down a little bit as we sat and talked. You could see, like, at first he just wanted to get out of there, but then I think he thought, okay, this guy seems safe or something, and so we had a little bit longer conversation, got to pray for him. But I mean, my heart just broke, like it was not, oh, this is horrible. This is a human that is carrying this thing. So I think getting proximate to the pain is a part of the jaded side.
Yeah. And I think it just reminds me of there's a great quote in a book called Exclusion and Embrace by Miroslav Volf, talking about a double exclusion that occurs where you exclude an outsider, an enemy, someone that you don't know and that weirds you out or whatever. We want to exclude them from the community of humans, and then we want to exclude ourselves from the community of sinners. And it's kind of this double exclusion going on, like, well, you're less than human and I'm not a sinner. But talking about it's in the presence of a crucified God where it's safe to be a sinner and, discover your humanity in that sense. And then to see the outsider that Jesus is dying for and going, wait, they're not excluded either. And to put an end to that double exclusion and kind of invitation into connection and community and things like that. And it really comes back to in the presence of a crucified Messiah. Yeah. And that's our source.
It's a powerful thing to see the Lord's capacity to transform someone. And I think if you can see that in the church and connect the dots to the one who's not transformed, it can be another component of that, right? Because what we're talking about is, and what you're saying, that exclusion, right, is like the dehumanizing, and it's so brokenly natural for us to dehumanize. I mean, I live on a rough part of town, and I pass probably 6 or 7 large encampments on the way home every day. And one of them is in my neighborhood now, which is hard for us because there's this beautiful, nice park right around the corner from us. I've got a little boy. My wife and I would love to take him to the park. And it's a challenging thing in my heart to have the combination of compassion for these broken people and to see this is an unsafety around the corner from my little boy, And so there is a huge flesh part of me that wants to just turn these daughters and sons of God into monsters. And at the same time, I've spent so much time with people living in that life and seeing that they're not. And at the same time, I've seen the transformation that happens. I mean, we just recently had someone in our church who was on the streets and dealing with some really intense demonic stuff. And we've seen a lot of really powerful transformation in this individual. And I remember a few years back when I was the high school pastor, I think it was the last summer camp I did, I had a number of as part of the morning sessions, I would have some of my leaders give some of their testimony. And I had this group of really rough kids. I mean, one kid who had been to prison and it was a baby daddy and he was out of prison already. And a clique of 3 or 4 boys in particular who were really, really rough kids and had come out of really rough lives. And one of those boys, his name was Jeremiah, was like, his dad had just gotten out of prison and he'd been raised by his grandma, and his dad had just given his life to the Lord. And so Jeremiah at the time was just like, this is weird, but I guess I'm all in, you know, but like, I have no understanding of what this looks like. And these boys, Jeremiah especially, but all these boys, when they'd come to youth group, they could not help but feel so other. Not because of what anybody else did or said, but they just looked at this group of, 60 or so students and leaders who dressed different, who talked different, who carried themselves different, And I remember when Michael McLean, who was you remember Michael, right? Mm-hmm. He was my intern for a while there. He gave his testimony. Michael was an awesome, solid guy, so full of the love of Jesus. And Michael had been a heroin addict and had been homeless and had grown up, getting guns pulled on him and all that kind of stuff. And you would know none of that knowing Michael, because of how full of Jesus he is these days. And he gave his testimony, and my wife gave her testimony of drugs and party and all the stuff that the Lord had brought her through in high school and broken home and all that. And I remember Jeremiah saying, I didn't know that the you guys were like me. Because he would say all the time, you don't know me. You don't know my life. But he was like, you do know me. You do know my life. And it's so crazy when you see the transformation that Jesus makes. It's like that person that was in that category that your heart says is not human. And then you meet someone who's looks human to even that broken part of you again. And you're like, all those people you dehumanized, they're just waiting for Jesus to transform them, And they are still human, even though in some ways maybe they're kind of not now. They're that kind of broken, Anyway, David, it was also a spicy message.
Spicy.
You didn't mean it to be spicy. You knew it was going to be, because you just kind of wading into stuff that the Lord wades into, but that brings so much gunk.
I almost post on Instagram prior to the message. So I'm looking at my notes here and I see, LGBTQ plus community. I see Black community. I see Roe versus Wade. I see, just like list all of the things in the notes that were there in my notes that we talked about. But, and that's obviously, that's a marketing ploy. That would get people to rise up. But I didn't want people coming into church like looking for the drama and looking for the spice. So obviously I didn't. It was kind of just a joke. But I felt that even in preparation. And I shared a little bit about that, how just even when I was getting ready to write my sermon and kind of working through stuff, I could just feel that, like, Lord, how do I not step on a landmine on accident? Like if there's something I need to step into and it's going to be hard, I'm fine with that. Like that's no problem, but I don't want to do it accidentally. And I don't want to do it in a way that, would cause people to feel alienated or other, in that regard. So I was sitting down to write the sermon, and then I look over and there's all these young guys, reading, practicing the way and praying. And I thought, oh, that was encouraging. So the Lord just gave me a lot of kind of encouragements. Actually, I listened to a bunch of different, podcasts, and then even some sermons from people here in town. And one shout out to Tim Birdwell, Phoenix Bible Church. We were just over there with All for One. So good. But they're doing a sermon series called "Let's Talk About It." And so they're talking about anger, they're talking about sexuality, they're talking about politics. These are their Sundays. And so I was listening to him, and it was so cool the way he did it, because he was like, look, I don't know if I have the perfect answers for all these things, but this is what I do have. And I thought, that's cool. And so that was a little bit of the approach. It was like, well, this is the stuff that I've done to try and figure out my role, like my family's role and our church family in society. Because another way to say political issues is society's pain. Yeah. Like politics is supposed to tell us who should have the power and how should they use that power, and ultimately to alleviate as much pain in society as possible. I mean, that should be the goal of power. It should be to alleviate pain, not create pain. And so that's just been our approach. And what was cool is, Living Streams, it's not like we're talking about these issues because it's 2024 and we're in election year and we're 6 weeks out from the election.
Yeah.
We've been talking about this for 8 years.
Yeah.
And so it was a funny response from the congregation, because I feel like a lot of people, it was helpful to get recentered onto kind of the way of Jesus engaging in politics, which is really just how to deal with society's pain and challenges. So most people, it was just, I heard him say it was like really a good reminder and kind of like settled them back into a little bit. But all the people who are newer to the church, I had a bunch of people going, wow, that was so like, I'm so, because they're looking for a way, they're looking for a political answer. They're trying to guard their own hearts and minds. And so I gave them something that they felt like was for this moment. And it's like, well, no, it's for every moment, it's all history, but it was new for them and helpful. So I thought that's great, but it also wasn't something that we, drummed up or something I came up with just because of this moment. So in that way, I feel like it had a lot more substance and weight to it also.
Yeah. Yeah. It tends to be that when you're leaning in to the Word of God and the Lord's way, it tends to be pretty substantial across time. Yeah. It's so interesting when you read the Old Testament. Or I remember the first time I read Augustine's Confessions, being shocked at how like this book that's, 1800 years old, 1600 years?
About 1800.
Okay, yeah. Dan's the one who's got the timeline down there. 200-300s. Reads like, this could have been written 5 years ago, you know? He's still dealing with the same things, and the Lord is still revealing the same stuff, and he's dealing with the same lies that are pretending to be new, that were not new 1800 years ago, and they're not new today. And the Lord in his way is so relevant. Human hearts and their brokennesses, they have not changed.
Yeah.
It feels like they're always changing, and yet it's just a broken record playing on repeat,
Totally.
And I think it's I think it's interesting. It might not be obvious to everybody, like the weight that gets carried in preaching sometimes. Sometimes every once in a while there's a message that's like, "Ooh, this is like easy fun," but sometimes it feels like I can't imagine it feels that different from a surgeon scrubbing in sometimes, where you're like, if I misstep, I will cut someone's life out, and you feel the weight of it. Yeah. And I don't know. I think it's just, it seems to me that a lot of people, they hear a message like that and they just think you came in locked and loaded to just dump your thoughts on whatever. But really what's happening is, and I know I know this feeling for myself, but I know I see it in you very much too, of like, I not in an unhealthy or an anxious way, but in a fear and trembling and a holy way. It's like, I'm coming in here with a sense of reverence and a fear of how I could really mess this up. And I want to just be right in line with what the Lord is doing and saying. And you're getting counsel, like Dan's referencing emails. Dan always gets copied on our sermon notes because he's one of the few and the most consistently like there with feedback. But Dan is like the voice that you rarely hear in a sermon that is coming through almost every sermon. Because he's a big part of helping us thread those needles and do that surgery. And and I know you were carrying that for sure, and you do a good job of. Yeah,
it was cool to remember that little boy who came to Jesus and gave him 5 loaves and 2 fish. And I pray that all the time. At the end of the day, Lord, I've done what I can, but I know it's very little. As far as what people need and as far as the challenges in life. But if you can take this offering, these few words, this little sermon that I've tried to read, to write, and if you can use it to feed people, to inspire people, to move people closer to your heart, then let it be. So I fall back on that a lot, and that's a helpful thing to remember when you're trying to deal with these challenges.
I think the other piece is you're not doing sermons from some radio tower far off in the distance, but you guys are pastors.
Yeah.
And it's probably 3 or 4 years ago, you were doing a sermon on 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and you're going, there's people in the world that can do a better sermon on 1 Corinthians chapter 15, but I'm called to be faithful to be here to do it. And the thing is, it's not that you're just faithful to do it here, but you're available. You're going, email me at david@livingstreams, call me, let's meet for coffee. It's the engaging in lives of people beyond just the preaching. I remember Luke Parker talking about like, oh man, I loved being the guy that, okay, once every 12 weeks you get to preach so you can go and prep extra and do whatever and show up and hit it out of the park. And then I became the college pastor and I preached every week, but it was more, I was involved in people's lives, and it didn't really matter so much, did you have a killer sermon, but was this sermon holding out the words of life as you engaged in people's lives? And I think that's kind of the invitation for all of us. This is not just hear a good, a TED Talk and a concert and we're off on our way. This is an invitation to engage. And yes, David or Alec or, different people speak from the front, but that speak from the front, the goal is to hold out words of life that we can engage together and find the way together.
Yeah. Yeah. And there definitely is, give and take in that regard. I mean, obviously on a Sunday, it's the preacher is speaking and the people are listening. But especially, it's funny right now, it's definitely increased where people are letting me know what they think I should preach or shouldn't preach. It's funny, that's new. That's a political, election year thing where people are coming to me now through email or whatever and or in person and saying, this is what you should preach, or we need to do this. And what's funny is you can almost hear the podcast person or the media person that they're listening to right behind them saying, if your pastor doesn't say this, he's a coward, or if he does say this, he's so brave. And so like I'm having to kind of filter that and say, okay, Lord, what are you wanting to do? And yet also engage with the people that I'm connected to, because they have a say. They have some, they have a say into all this, and we have elders and all that. But then coming out of the message after what's being said, then there's a whole nother filtering process where people come up afterwards. And I had one lady come up afterwards, and her and her husband, and honestly, I thought it was a very, it was kind of an interesting moment, because she looked at me and not with any kind of animosity or any. There was just a moment and kind of a soft question she asked me. She said, "Can I ask you who you are planning to vote for?" And it was so funny because I was like, "Oh gosh," and my brain did a number of things. At first, I was going, okay, is this something that, something I said in the message that she's wanting to kind of come at, or is this, that's what you get out of the message? I know that's not, but none of that was the way it was. I knew that wasn't what they were dealing with. And I just felt like they were kind of just going, I can't tell who you, through your messages, are saying you're going to vote for. And you're bringing up points that every once in a while I think you're saying, okay, we'll go this or that or this or that. And so I think they were just saying, I'd like to know, because I'm wrestling, and maybe you could tell me, and that will help me as I process. But it was just such a non-emotional, non-dramatic moment that I actually said, yeah, I think I'm okay with that. And again, because it's one-on-one. Yeah. I'm not going to say that in a broad room or whatever, because everyone's going to have to, but it was like, if you two want to know, and we had this little dialogue that, I think I shared a couple of things that I was thinking, they shared some things that they were thinking. And then we get to walk away from that, and who knows, maybe we'll change our vote. Maybe we won't change our vote. But the reason I said I was able to do it is because I said, it's not that big a deal to me. Mm-hmm. It's not my life or death thing. It's like maybe number 11 or 12 on kind of what I care about. So I have all these other things, Jesus, my family, all these other things. So it was like, yeah, this is a little part of my life, and I would love to dialogue on that. And we even in the hall today, someone else came up and said, "Can I ask you?" Because they heard that story, and so I was like, yeah. I'm happy to dialogue about this. And we had a little bit of a good exchange, I think, different ideas. And then I would say something and you guys would say it, and I'd be like, oh, I guess what I was saying doesn't really have much substance to it. So that one's gone, as we're all trying to feel this out. So yeah, it's been interesting.
And I think part of what makes this scenario where someone might feel like, oh, I can't peg you down there.
Yeah.
It is a consistency of like, I want to follow Jesus. Right. And so like in your sermon, you're talking about stuff that we're doing, caring for refugees. Well, that falls generally on one side of the political spectrum. In your sermon,
Depends
you're talking
on
about
who you talk to.
You're talking about alleviating the pain of that we heard in 2020 coming out from the Black community, and well, that falls on that same side. And then you're talking about abortion and caring for the unborn, and that falls on the other side. You know what I mean? And so,
but once we start talking sides, I think we're already lost.
I think that's my point. Is like we are so conditioned,
right?
And we all hate it, right? Like the amount of people who want to just be independent at this point is at its highest it's ever been, I think, more or less. Right? Nobody likes our two-party system except for a few people who really like their party, and yet everybody gets really sucked into their party. And it's like when you're following Jesus and when He's the one who's Lord of your life, you're going to have to recognize that the political party with whom you feel connected or affiliated or with whom you're registered or whatever, like they're going to miss it hard some places and they're going to miss it a little other places, whichever party you're picking in this two-party system. Mm-hmm. And so following Jesus means you're going to stand up against, your political tribe if you even are going to claim a political tribe, you know? And that's really confusing for some people because we're given a false dichotomy. We're given a blue or red. That's all there is to it. And that's just not, the kingdom is not blue or red.
Yeah.
Doesn't work that way.
And when you come to church, we're not promoting a party. We're not promoting a person. As far as a political person, but we're promoting a way. Like there is a way that Jesus taught us to walk and interact with. And the way is Sermon on the Mount. The way is so different. Like the invasion of the King of heaven, it's like the army is not tanks and it's not politicians and it's not charisma. He comes in with the meek and the mourning and the merciful, and the poor in spirit. Like this is God's army,
takes the hopeless and goes, there's my army. I can use that to transform the world. Totally. And that really is the way of Jesus.
It's so amazing.
What you were saying was making me think of, it's actually a word that gets used in society, a fun word, shibboleth. In Judges chapter 12, I think it was the Ephraimites would say sibboleth because they couldn't do the SH in shibboleth. And that's how you knew if they were an insider and outsider. And as humans, we like to make insiders and outsiders. Can you give me your checklist of which political party you're with? What side of this issue are you on? And if you check all the right boxes, you can be an insider. But if you get the shibboleth wrong, you're an outsider. And what Scripture constantly wants to do.
So did you get vaccinated or not?
Yeah, exactly. It's in Scripture, the narrative of Scripture showing how God's constantly upsetting our shibboleths and our understanding of who's the insider and who's the outsider, and does it in a big way when all of a sudden Gentiles are welcome into the family of God and going, okay, you used to have an insider-outsider mindset here, but let me tell you about it. Or in Jonah, it was the Ninevites. Well, they're definitely outsiders. And the response that God has is, there's 120,000 people in that city. Should I not care? For all those people that don't know their right hand from their left and their many animals, it's going, you've made them outsiders. Wrong. The goal of being the people of God is to take outsiders and make them insiders. And so we have this political system that wants to polarize us and make outsiders of others. And the way of Jesus is to go, no, if you're a human, then you're created in the image of God and you're welcomed into the community of God by the blood of Jesus.
Yeah. It's funny you said that. I was just thinking this week about how, again, part of what just a rabbit trail my brain is taking off this book I'm reading. But I was thinking about the story of Jonah. He doesn't even mention it in the book, and how wildly offensive that story is to an Israelite. you know, like you're like those are the people who tore us from our home. And I don't know, maybe you have insight into when it was written, but my understanding is it's probably between the fall of Israel and Judah.
There's every
nobody
option
knows.
given.
Okay,
there's a huge range. Yeah.
But either way, the Ninevites, the Assyrians, not at any point in time friends of Israel, and pretty gnarly people, you know. And so it's just so wildly offensive that the God of Israel would have compassion on them. And that's baked into the story. Jonah, man of God, is like, no, absolutely not. You know, and that's and to have read that. So in fact, I even was speaking. There was an Orthodox woman that I've been having some phone calls with because she's been interested in Jesus stuff a little bit, but still very much, and I should say Jewish Orthodox, not Greek Orthodox. And we, in our conversations about Jesus, at some point she was talking about the turn of the other cheek and stuff, and she was saying, I just think he was a rabbi who went way too far. And I was like, well, I can see why you'd feel that way. Well, we were talking about Palestine and stuff like, you know.
Good Samaritan, the Good Samaritan story.
Yeah.
It can't be a Good Samaritan.
It's pretty gnarly. And that feels so light to us, but like when you put it in the right metaphors or compare, you know, like imagine telling a bunch of Ukrainians, you know, like that you know, the story of Jonah with Russians, you know, or the story of the Good Samaritan with Russians or whatever. It's like these people are our brothers and they have massacred us, you know.
I think there's a realism to the scriptures though, because right next to Jonah you have Nahum, and in Jonah Jonah's response was, I knew you were the Lord, slow to anger, you know, forgiving, and like that you're a bleeding heart, forgiving God. And that was his complaint. And then Nahum has prophecy against Nineveh, and it's the other half of that same verse going, but he won't acquit the guilty. And you've got these two prophetic books sitting there next to each other going, yeah, there's a tension. Like, is safety in my neighborhood important? With my children? Yes. And is inviting the outsider in and making them the insider important? Yes. Yeah. And so it's kind of like, we're not given straight answers, we're given the way, and we're given an invitation to be led by the Spirit. And I just know, like, I mean, you can think of all the situations you've either pastored in or our own live situations. I know stories from you guys, my story, where you kind of go, there's no book for what to do in this situation, but there is a book that says there's the one that leads you in these situations. And so, like, if you've ever found yourself in that situation where you're going, there's no book for this broken situation that gives me, you know, step 1, step 2, step 3, but it is, you know, as many as led by the Holy Spirit, you know, belong to Christ. And that's what we're called into. That's who we're following, and that's who leads us.
That's what I love about that Tim Keller quote, that we avoid political simplicity. Because these are challenging issues that people have been dealing with since the beginning of time, and it's just our turn to try and deal with them. But we avoid political simplicity, we avoid political complacency. You know, can't just stick your head in the sand, can't just turn and pretend it's not there. You have to engage, and you know, and we really do have something to offer in the way of Jesus and in the scriptures. And then we also avoid political primacy, where, you know, it's all there is politics, and all we ever talk about, and it's the most important thing, and we have to engage in, like, you know. And
if I get control, I can make everything right.
Yeah,
be empowered.
And grab the sword, the power of the sword, the power of the government. That's how we're going to bring the kingdom, and Jesus didn't do that. And there's another thing. So that was Tim Keller. And then there's the Carey Nieuwhof leadership podcast, and he's actually been interviewing some major Christian leaders like N.T. Wright, Mark Sayers. There's some others on there too, but there's a lot of little bits of gold in each of them, and how to navigate these times, whether you're leading a business, whether you're leading your own heart, leading your family, or leading a church. I think it's all applicable. But in there, somebody had said something about, you know, you can be biblical and not Christ-like. And so I was thinking about it more, and I actually did post this, but I said, you know, you can't be Christ-like and not be biblical, because he came to fulfill the law, not abolish it. But you can be biblical and not be Christ-like, which is basically the Pharisees, right? That was his big problem with them. And so I think, trying to be Christ-like obviously is the goal, and to be careful that, we want to stay biblical, and we want to draw those lines, those boundary markers. Remember the picture of the priest who's just mending the fences? I loved that analogy you gave us a long time ago, where we're not some sort of angry tyrant, like standing out the fence just trying to shoot anybody. But whenever someone tries to move the fence, or when someone tries to tear a hole in the fence, we just mend the fences and say, no, we uphold the scriptures, we uphold the truth, and we cannot change it, because it will bring destruction. It'll bring the weeds and the wolves in. So we have to uphold those things, but we have to do it in a Christ-like way. And that was the picture you had of almost like the farmer. The pastor is just this old farmer, just going around mending the fences, not screaming and shouting, hey, everybody does it, but just continuing to uphold those things in a Christ-like way, full of grace, full of grace, full of grace and truth and truth and truth. I loved that analogy. And I think there are Christians who, and that's a challenge that we have, is like, there is a point at which you do divide.
Yeah.
Like unity requires diversity, but it also requires a limit to that diversity for it to actually be unity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a little bit of what we're dealing with as Christians right now, is trying to figure out how to engage in the pain and to stay unified with other believers and all those things. But there does come a point where Jesus is saying, I'm not joining with these Pharisees and their temple and all of those type of things. I'm not joining with these Romans and these Herodians. And when they kept trying to pull him into a camp, when the Pharisees and the Herodians came and said, should we pay taxes? They were both trying to claim him for their own or discredit him. And he didn't join in those type of things. So there is a point at which we do create separation. And it's just hard for us to know when and where that is.
Yeah, I think the shorthand way to talk about that is unity is easy if you forget holiness, and holiness is much easier if you just decide to jettison unity. Wait, how do we hold on to both of these things?
Yeah.
Was there anything else in the message that you were hoping maybe to unpack a little bit more, or maybe Dan, something that struck you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things was, again, just how challenging it is what we're being told and what we're being fed. And you had something that you sent me that didn't make it into the message, but it made it into my heart and into my mind, and a regard from a story from Lord of the Rings, which I thought was so important.
Yeah, I think it's just one that, depending on which news network you watch or things like that, there's just a picture in Lord of the Rings. And I think it's actually better explained in the books, but it's been so long I don't remember. But if you remember the little crystal ball that Saruman is looking through, and then we find out Denethor in Gondor has one, and it's basically the way that Sauron communicates.
Sauron's the evil
bad king, and everything else. And
deceiver.
And one of the things I think it's detailed in the book is he can't tell lies through it or show lies, but he can select what he shows. And so what he would do is only show depressing, the world is going to collapse kind of images through that. And so Denethor, who's kind of the steward of Gondor, basically goes into...
That's the crazy guy who tries to burn his son in the third movie, for those of you who are...
Yeah, spoiler alert,
not
if you haven't
nerds
watched
like
it
me
in
and Dan.
24 years. But yeah, basically Denethor has only watched from there, so he knows what's going on in the world as far as he knows, and there's no hope in what's being shown. And it drives him to the point where he's going to burn his own son, and where he's going to burn himself, and he goes on fire, jumping off of a cliff because he was despaired. And it was his view of the world and what he was allowed to see that drove him to despair. And I think, depending on which news network you're watching, each of those can be a version of despair of what's coming against, and this is why you have to vote this way, and the world's coming to an end unless this happens. And it can drive us to despair if our view of the world is only that. I'm not saying you shouldn't watch the news or things like that, but you need to have an awareness of, I'm only being shown a selection and arrangement of what's going on in culture, and my primary needs to be, I know what's going on in culture because of the people's lives I engage around me. I'm a parent with my children at school. I'm a member of my church. I'm a member of my workforce, and I see the issues in my workforce and get to engage with them there. But that's much easier than becoming polarized by watching a news network that makes you afraid in one direction or another direction. And so I think that's a powerful picture in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine if we had a piece of black glass that we could carry with us everywhere we go that would only show us horrible, bad, sad things about the world?
Yes.
How destructive that might be. It's interesting.
Talking about the phone.
Yeah. Tolkien wrote that.
We have that
quite a while before phones. But as you point that out, it's become a thing for me that I more and more think is so important. We talked about it a little on the podcast, but I think digital discipline has become a must for a follower of Jesus at this point. I remember this was maybe 10, 15 years ago, I started to think that, we should probably talk about that a little bit. At this point, I think it's become, the way we engage with the digital world has become probably the single greatest hurdle to practicing the way of Jesus for a believer. And we have to start looking weird when it comes to the way we interact with those things, because it's death by 1,000 cuts, like you don't realize what an impact on your soul it has that you're spending time on social media or on news networks or whatever, that you're spending time listening to people who get paid lots of money to be angry about political situations, that you're looking at the world through a lens in a digital world that doesn't have to be real, and isn't real. And sometimes it's outright fabrications. And then to your point, with that analogy from Lord of the Rings, it's like, even just showing you only true things, but selectively. I mean, that happens all the time. I don't know if you guys have noticed this cycle, but like then something will go viral, and all of a sudden you think it's happening all over the world, because what happens is one thing goes viral, and so the news networks are all looking for similar stories, right? So there was that young influencer a little while ago whose boyfriend or whatever murdered her or something, and she went missing, you know what I mean? And was Gabby Petito, right? And now all of a sudden young women are disappearing all over the world. But really what happened is there's a pretty static number of that happening, but now the news is zooming in it, or a plane goes down, right? And one hits the news cycle for whatever reason, and next thing you know, your algorithms are, and you think it's not safe to get on a plane anymore, but planes are going down at the same rate they have been for decades, but you think it's happening left and right. And it's a problem.
An excellent resource about exactly that. Digital hygiene is what kind of the actual term for that is. Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport is an excellent book.
Yeah.
It's not a podcast.
I mean, he probably has a podcast too. But Cal Newport describes, like, if you don't pay for a service, that's because you're the product. Not like you're not using Instagram as
it's free.
Instagram.
It's you.
Anxious Generation by what's his name? I can't remember his name, but Anxious Generation. He's written a couple books. He's kind of in that smart people world of books, bestseller kind of stuff.
Is that digital minimalism? Is that why you only have one camera today, Dalton? Working on that.
That's a different thing. That's just because I was a little lazy. But
you're so right, though. I mean, the formation, like if we want to be formed into the image of God, into the image of Christ, like, there is a counter formation that is having to happen, because what these phones, what the media, what society, culture is forming us into right now is very anxious people, very like wound up people. And it's true. I mean, I had a guy today, I heard a guy describing, the attention thing, exactly what you're saying. People used to spend all this money to try and find things in the earth and then mine them and draw them out, and then be able to sell that. And right now people have stopped looking into the ground. They're looking at you, and they're like, how do I suck the attention out of you and sell that. It's creepy to think about that, but it's like they're wanting our attention so bad that they're willing to almost kill us. You know, they're willing to suck the life out of us to be able to have that attention so they can sell it. And it's leaving people empty. It's leaving people, you know, with very unhealthy souls. And we want to be formed into the image. We want to be whole. We want to be healthy. We want to be, you know, fully alive in our souls. And we have a real challenge on our hands.
And if you're listening and you don't think that you have a problem, you know, I would say, have you ever like been on the side of the conversation where you're chatting with someone who maybe, you know, has a couple packs a day, cigarette addiction, or maybe an alcohol problem, or maybe they're on something harder, and you've had the conversation where they say, "Oh, I could quit anytime I wanted. I like it," you know, and you think, "Okay, well, let's see," you know, like, can you go a day without a single cigarette? Like, what's going to happen? And now turn that around, look at yourself in the mirror a little bit, and let me ask you, like, can you leave your phone in the drawer for 24 hours? How are you going to feel if you leave your phone away? But literally just put it away, turn it off, put it in your nightstand, and don't touch it for 24 hours. If that feels any bit weird for you, and if you think, "Oh, I could do that," then do it. I dare you. Do it. And if it feels weird for you, uncomfortable or painful, or if there's any anxiety, you have a problem. And you have an addiction. And that thing is pulling on you. And it is forming you, and there are things doing so intentionally. They are molding the way you see the world to their benefit. And at the core of that, at least at the core of some of it, is the spirit of the Antichrist, is the enemy, trying to pull your attention away from Jesus. And so it's at least worth recognizing there's a problem and then figuring out what I can do about it. And it is in the way of you and Jesus in some significant ways. It can't keep you from Jesus. Nothing can, but it's in the way. But that's anybody got something nicer to say before we close out?
I had a funny version of it, which was about 15 years ago. My coworker and I had both kids about the same age, and he had a 3-year-old that our boss was calling his cell phone, and the little 3-year-old, I think it was, picked it up and was like, "Daddy's boss, Daddy's boss," holding and waving the phone in the air, calling it Daddy's boss. And, you know, we don't want these to be our boss.
No, 100%. Thanks. That's a lighter way to note it than some reproof. But thank you guys for listening. Thanks for being a church, a community of people who really want to be formed into the image of Christ, who want to follow Jesus very much. And if you're listening to this, what's great is there's at least a little part of you that's taken some of that digital discipline, that's leaning into Jesus, saying, "I do want to be formed into Christ, and I want to use the good bits of this little screen that I have in front of me." And I know if you're listening to this, you're someone who's at least willing, willing to be challenged to engage in society's pain. And I'm grateful to be a part of the body of Christ that has been engaging in society's pain for a couple thousand years now, and will continue to do so until the Lord comes and takes away that pain. So thank you guys so much. And we'll see you on Sunday.